Alright, I just want to shoot a quick video and go over the activity we did today in class. Just in case you weren't able to make it and you're working from home and you wanted to see this. We did a short activity on RAIDs and RAID drives and how they're set up and what they are. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first, what is a RAID? RAID is a way for a computer to see multiple drives as one drive. It's a way to install 5, 10 hard drives in your computer, and your computer sees it all as one drive. In other words, gives you one drive letter, rather than if you put 10 hard drives in your computer without setting up as a RAID, you'd have 10 drive letters, and you'd have to decide what you're going to store where. You'd have drive C, D, E, F, so on, and you'd have to decide what files you're going to put where. And if you set them up in a RAID configuration, it sees all those drives as one drive letter, so it's just easier to work with if you're gonna work with multiple drives. So the four main types of drives, RAIDs. You have 0. Well, let's just go to the next slide. This is what I asked the class today. So you got RAID 0, which is striped, RAID 1, which is mirrored, RAID 5, striped with parity, and RAID 1 plus 0, striped and mirrored. That actually is the name for it, 1 plus 0 or 1, 0. A lot of people will say it's RAID 10, which is not the correct name. And the reason it's called 1, 0 or 1 plus 0 is because it is a RAID 1 and a RAID 0 together. So the minimum number of drives for RAID 0. The minimum number for RAID 0 is 2, and you'll see in the setup here. The way that it stores the data, you have to have a minimum of 2 drives because it stripes the data across both drives. RAID 0 is good for speed because it's writing across both drives at the same time, but it's not good for redundancy because if you lose one of these drives, if one of these drives goes bad, you've lost all the data on it. There is no backup So the main benefit of RAID 0 is speed. So we'll get here and see that here with the pros and cons of RAID 0. It has faster read and write speeds, but the con is no redundancy, no kind of backup. In what scenario would you use a RAID 0? The only time I've actually ever installed a RAID 0 was setting up a gaming rig. Most of the time, your progress is saved online, at least on PC games. So you don't have to worry about losing data, but you do want as fast speed as you can. You don't want latency while you're trying to play a game, and because milliseconds count when you're trying to shoot someone before they shoot you. So RAID 0 for a gaming system is what most people set up. You can also set that up for live streaming. Like if you're doing any kind of live streaming on the internet and you don't need to back up the data, or you don't need to worry about losing the data, it's just streaming straight to the internet. Because you want as much speed as you can there so you have no latency. So the minimum number of drives for a RAID 1, which we saw earlier, is striped. The minimum number of drives for a RAID 1 is also 2 drives. But it writes on one drive. It writes the data to one drive and then mirrors it over to the other. Rather than striping it across both drives, it writes all the data that you're writing to drive 1, and then it creates an exact mirror of that drive on the drive 2. It makes it a little bit slower because it has to write to a drive and then copy it all to the second drive. It makes it a little bit slower for writes, but fast for reads, because it's only when you go back and read this data, now it's only reading off the one drive. But the downfall of this, let's go to the pros and cons. So it's got fault tolerance and redundancy, which is good. Increased read speed, but lower write speed. And you're wasting a lot of space, because if you see here, since you're mirroring, you only get one drive worth of space. So if these are 1 terabyte drives and you have 2 terabytes total installed, you can only write to 1 terabyte. You can only write to that first drive, and then it mirrors all that over to the second drive. So you do lose a lot of space in that. And of course, the con is higher cost, because if you need 3 terabytes of space to actually write to, you would have to buy 6 terabytes worth of hard drives. So it's a much higher cost to set up a RAID 1. But you have the redundancy and increased read speed. So in what scenario would you use a RAID 1? Most of the time, RAID 1s are used for business type servers, but not one that are high use, such as a DHCP server or an Active Directory server. Something that doesn't get constant writes to it all the time, but maybe read, might get a lot of reads. Like Active Directory, you're not constantly writing to it. Maybe when you create a new user account every once in a while, but every time a user logs into Active Directory, it has to read that for their authentication. So a server that gets a lot of reads but not as many writes might use a RAID 1 because, of course, they need redundancy. They don't want the server to go down. Now, what's the minimum number of drives for a RAID 5? RAID 5 is striped with parity, and the minimum number of drives that you need for that is 3. It's very similar to a RAID 0 in that it stripes the data across the drives, but it also has the parity stripe up top, which gives you redundancy. You lose 30% of your disk space for that parity strip. Basically what it does is it writes enough data in this parity strip that if one drive went down, and you can only lose one in this setup with 3 drives, that if one drive went down, it could rebuild that drive. So let's say drive 1 went down. There's enough data in the parity strip on drive 2 and drive 3 that it can rebuild this data that's on drive 1. And like I said, you lose 30% of your drive space here. So the pros are fault tolerance. You can lose 1 drive and still recover. Increased performance because it's striping, so it does. This is the kind of the best of both worlds with the RAID 0 and RAID 1, but you'll see it's even better in the RAID 1.0. The RAID 5 gives you redundancy as well as increased performance. The cons are you are going to lose 30% of disk space and lower performance when doing a lot of writes because of the parity. So it does also have the con that you have with RAID 1 because it's lower for writes. It's good for reads, but a little bit lower on writes because it has to write to the drive and then also to the parity stripe. So what scenario would you use a RAID 5? Another one's going to be it's anything that would get a lot of reads but not as many writes, but you also need redundancy. So servers such as a file server or an application server. So the only time you're writing to a file server is when you put the files on there. Everybody who downloads files from there or uses the files that you put on there is all reads. So you are writing when you put the files there, but then you're going to get hundreds of reads as people are using those files. Same way with an application server. You write to it when you install the application, but after that, all your users are only doing reads as they use the application that you put on there. It's all reads. So RAID 5 is good for a file server or an application server or someplace where you're going to do a lot of reads but not as many writes, and you do need redundancy. Now let's talk about the 1+0, the minimum number of drives that you need for a 1+0. Minimum number is 4, and they always have to be put in pairs because you are striping and mirroring. So like I said earlier, it is a RAID 1 and a RAID 0 together. So you're striping across the 2 drives, which gives you the fast write speed, and then it takes that and mirrors it over to the other 2 drives. So you always have to be in pairs. You can do it in 4 or 6. If you had 6 here, it would write a stripe across the first 3 drives and then mirror that to the other 3. So this does cure the a lot of the stuff going on in some of the earlier raids, but it does have cons, definitely, where you can write fast and read fast to these. Well, let's go look at the cons. So you got fault tolerance, you got increased performance, which is even better than the RAID 5 performance. It's got better reads and writes than RAID 5. But you do lose a lot of disk space. You lose half of your disk space. So if you're setting up a server, especially a file server, and you wanted 10 terabytes of disk space, you actually have to buy 20 terabytes worth of disks. So, because you're going to lose half of it. So the cons are definitely losing all that disk space and the high cost. Now, who would use, or where would you use this RAID? Well, one thing, only businesses really use a RAID 1.0. Only businesses are willing to lose that much data or that much drive space in order to set this up and put that much money into it. Most people don't use a 1.0 at home. I personally use a RAID 5 at home on my media server. But you would use a 1.0 for any server that you need redundancy and is going to have high reads and writes, such as a database server. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Something where people are inputting information and reading information. So you're going to have a lot of reads and writes on a database server. That's the only one I can think of right now. But a database server or any server that has to be up all the time, so you want redundancy, and you're going to have a lot of reads and writes to it. And it's a good deal of money to set that up because you need double the drives of what you actually want space for. So in class, we also went over one of the questions that you may see on a test that are similar, that would deal with a RAID. So a technician is configuring a new web server and must have 10 terabytes of fault-tolerant storage while minimizing the number of failure points. The applications on the server also require highest performance availability. All right, so when I approach a question like this, I try to start ruling things out. Like, could it be A? Could it be a RAID 0 with 2 5 terabyte drives? Well, first, they want fault tolerance. So RAID 0 is striped. There's no fault tolerance on there. There's no redundancy. So A is out. B, RAID 1 does have redundancy, so it meets that. But if we do 2 5 terabyte drives in a RAID 1, as you know, we lose 50%. So we're only going to get 5 terabytes of space, and they wanted 10 terabytes of space. So that rules out B. C is a RAID 5, which has a redundancy. We got 3 5 terabyte drives, and we're going to lose 30% of that. So roughly 30% of 15 terabytes is going to bring us down to about 11 terabytes. So it does meet the space requirement, and it meets the requirement for redundancy. So we'll put that one on the shelf now. It's possible. Let's look at the RAID 1.0 with 4 or 5 terabyte drives. So of course we know RAID 1.0 has redundancy, so it meets that requirement. It also, we're going to lose 50%. So 4 or 5 terabyte drives, that's 20 terabytes. We'll have 10 terabytes to write on, which meets the other requirement. So we could use a RAID 5 or a RAID 1.0 to meet this requirement. So there's one phrase in there that tells us which one we need to use, and that's highest performance available. You're going to get questions like this on the test where it'll say choose the best option. In this case, highest performance available. Well, going through this session here, we know that RAID 1.0 performs better than RAID 5. Even though they both would meet the criteria for this question, the RAID 1.0 would be the answer for that because it is the highest performance available. Now, if they had said something in there about highest performance available while also saving costs, then we're back to a RAID 5. Because a RAID 10 is much more expensive to set up, and a RAID 5, it does have high performance and will save us money. So that was the presentation we went through today. I'm also going to send out the quiz that the students who were sitting in class did. as well as I'm going to be shooting in a video going over the quiz and looking at each question individually and figuring out why the answer is the right answer.